What if I told you that a man who left school at age 7 discovered a spiritual secret so powerful that it healed diseases doctors had given up on, restored marriages on the brink of collapse, and turned financial disasters into abundance? And he did it all with just 4 simple words? This isn't some feel-good motivational story or empty religious promise. This is about Smith Wigglesworth, a man whose very name became synonymous with the impossible becoming possible. And today you're going to learn the exact principle that made it all happen. Now here's what makes this story so remarkable. Wigglesworth wasn't born into privilege or handed ancient mystical knowledge. He was a simple plumber from England who could barely read. Yet somehow this ordinary man tapped into something extraordinary, a spiritual principle so profound that it defied medical science, challenged conventional religious thinking, and produced results that skeptics simply couldn't explain away. Tuberculosis vanished. Terminal cancers disappeared. Broken bones mended in moments. And it all came down to understanding 4 words that most people read right past without grasping their true power. But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. Has this ever happened to you? You've prayed, you've hoped, you've tried everything you know to change a difficult situation in your life, but nothing seems to work? Maybe it's a health condition that won't improve, financial pressure that keeps mounting, or a relationship that feels beyond repair. You've done all the right things, followed all the advice, but the breakthrough just isn't coming. What if the problem isn't that you're not trying hard enough? What if you're, approaching it from entirely the wrong direction? This is exactly what Wigglesworth discovered. The turning point in his ministry didn't come from learning more techniques or studying more theology. It came from a radical shift in how he understood reality itself. He realized that most people, even sincere believers, were operating from a consciousness of separation, seeing themselves as powerless humans, trying to get help from a distant God. But when Wigglesworth grasped these 4 words at a depth that transformed his entire being, everything changed. He stopped fighting against problems and started operating from a completely different level of consciousness. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. This isn't about positive thinking or visualization exercises. This isn't about repeating affirmations or manifesting your desires. What Wigglesworth understood goes far deeper than any of that. He discovered a spiritual law as reliable as gravity, as consistent as mathematics, but operating in a dimension most people never access. And the beautiful thing is, this principle doesn't require special gifts, religious credentials, or years of study. It simply requires understanding and applying these 4 words in a way that shifts your fundamental consciousness. The difference between those who experience miracles and those who remain stuck isn't about who prays harder or has more faith. It's about who understands the relationship between consciousness and reality. Wigglesworth proved this thousands of times. When consciousness changes, conditions change, not through manipulation or positive thinking, but through alignment with a spiritual principle that operates at the very foundation of existence itself. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic because understanding what Wigglesworth discovered about consciousness is absolutely crucial to everything that follows. Here's the hidden truth that most people miss their entire lives. We walk around believing we're separate. Separate from the divine, separate from abundance, separate from healing, separate from the very source of life itself. This isn't just a religious concept or philosophical idea. This separation consciousness is the invisible force behind every struggle you've ever faced. When you wake up worried about money, you're operating from separation. When illness grips your body and fear grips your mind, you're experiencing separation. When relationships crumble and you feel utterly alone, that's separation consciousness manifesting in your reality. Think about how you approach problems in your life. Be honest with yourself for a moment. When something goes wrong, when the diagnosis comes back negative, when the bank account hits 0, when the person you love walks away, what's your first instinct? Most people immediately shift into survival mode. They start fighting, struggling, trying to force solutions, desperately searching for answers outside themselves. This is the journey that 99% of humanity takes, and it's exhausting because you're swimming against a current you don't even know exists. But Wigglesworth discovered something that changed everything. When Jesus said those 4 words, "I and the Father," followed by "are one," he wasn't claiming something special just for himself. He was revealing the fundamental structure of reality itself. This divine nature, this infinite intelligence, this creative power that people call God or Source or universal consciousness, it's not separate from you. It never has been. That separation is an illusion, but it's an illusion so convincing that it creates your entire experience of reality. If these teachings resonate with you and you want to continue exploring how consciousness transforms reality, I'd love to have you subscribe to this channel. There's so much more depth to uncover together about applying spiritual principles to your everyday life. Bro, impact of this realization cannot be overstated. When you truly grasp that you and the Father are one, something shifts at the deepest level of your being. It's not about understanding it intellectually. Plenty of people can quote spiritual texts and explain divine unity. The transformation happens when it becomes your lived experience, when it drops from your head into your heart, and then into your very cells. Suddenly, you're not a powerless human, begging for help from a distant deity. You're the expression of divine consciousness itself, operating in human form. This is where the revelations get really interesting, because Wigglesworth proved this wasn't just theory. He would stand in front of people who had been given death sentences by their doctors, tuberculosis eating away their lungs, cancers spreading unchecked, bodies broken beyond medical repair. And instead of seeing sick people who needed fixing, he saw something entirely different. He recognized the divine consciousness. That was their true nature, the perfect spiritual reality underlying the distorted physical appearance. He didn't fight the disease. He didn't struggle against the symptoms. He simply held the awareness of oneness so powerfully that the person's consciousness shifted to match that truth, and their body responded accordingly. This is the mindset shift that changes everything. You're not trying to get something from God. You're not attempting to convince the universe to give you what you need. You're recognizing what already is, what has always been, what can never be otherwise. The wholeness, the abundance, the love, the creative power, it's all already present because your true identity is divine consciousness, individualized. Write in the comments, "I'm ready for this shift," if this resonates with you, because what we're about to explore next will show you exactly how Wigglesworth actually applied this principle in his life, and the behind the scenes of his approach reveals something most people find completely counterintuitive. When someone came to him desperately sick, financially ruined, or emotionally shattered, he didn't do what you'd expect. He didn't immediately start praying for the problem to go away. He didn't try to fix symptoms or manipulate circumstances. Instead, he made a decision that seemed almost reckless. He completely ignored the problem itself and returned his consciousness to that fundamental truth: I and the Father are one. Now think about how radical this is. Someone's dying of tuberculosis, and Wigglesworth doesn't focus on the tuberculosis. A family's about to lose everything, and he doesn't strategize about money. A marriage is falling apart, and he doesn't give relationship advice. What he understood, and what most people struggle to grasp, is that all these problems exist only in separation consciousness. They're real experiences, absolutely, but they're effects, not causes. The cause is always consciousness, and consciousness, disconnected from its divine source, creates every form of limitation you can imagine. This is where the transformation becomes practical rather than just philosophical. Wigglesworth discovered that in the consciousness of oneness, certain things become impossible. You can't have lack when you're aware of your connection to infinite abundance. You can't experience disease when you recognize your true nature as perfect spiritual wholeness. You can't be limited when you know yourself as the expression of limitless creative power. These aren't denials of what appears to be happening. They're recognitions of what's true at a deeper level than physical appearances. The journey he took people on wasn't about pretending everything was fine or using positive affirmations to override reality. It was about shifting their consciousness from the level where problems exist to the level where problems cannot exist. And here's what makes this so powerful. This isn't something you force or struggle toward. When your consciousness truly aligns with the truth of oneness, transformation happens automatically. It's as natural and inevitable as darkness disappearing when you turn on a light. You don't have to fight the darkness. You don't have to push it out of the room. You simply introduce light, and darkness cannot remain. Wigglesworth proved this mechanism thousands upon thousands of times. Person after person would come with conditions that medical science had pronounced hopeless, and he would hold this consciousness of divine oneness so steadily that something would shift in their awareness. Not through his personal power or special gifts, but through his unwavering recognition of spiritual law. And once their consciousness shifted, once they stopped identifying with the separated, limited, diseased self, and recognized their true identity as divine consciousness expressing, their bodies, circumstances, and relationships would naturally align with that new awareness. The impact of understanding this cannot be measured. You're not trying to become whole, you're recognizing the wholeness you already are. You're not attempting to attract abundance. You're acknowledging your inseparable connection to infinite supply. You're not fighting against disease. You're seeing through the illusion to the spiritual perfection that has never been touched by physical conditions. This is why Wigglesworth could produce consistent results where others failed. He wasn't operating from hope or wishful thinking. He was operating from spiritual law, as precise and reliable as gravity or mathematics, but functioning at a level most people never access. Put down in the comments, "I see the truth," if you're beginning to understand how consciousness creates your experience, because what comes next will show you the exact pattern that Wigglesworth taught people to follow, and the revelations become even more powerful when you see how ordinary people applied this in their actual lives. Let me share 2 stories that demonstrate the hidden truth about how consciousness transformation creates real-world change. Margaret had been living in absolute agony for 12 years. Rheumatoid arthritis had twisted her hands and swollen her joints, to the point where the simple act of buttoning a shirt brought tears to her eyes. She'd been to 3 different specialists, tried every medication available, followed every protocol recommended. The verdict was unanimous and devastating. This condition would only worsen as she aged. She had accepted this as her unchangeable reality, her permanent identity. Margaret, the woman with crippling arthritis. Then she attended one of Wigglesworth's lectures, and something clicked in her awareness. For the first time, she saw how completely she'd been identifying with separation consciousness. She'd been seeing herself as a victim, as someone damaged and broken, as a body under attack by disease. But when she heard those 4 words and truly understood their meaning, a pathway opened in her mind. She began a practice that would transform everything. Whenever pain flared or fear gripped her, she would stop and return to the awareness. I and the Father are one, not as a desperate plea, not as wishful thinking, but as a recognition of truth. Within 6 months, her doctor stood there baffled, looking at test results and examining joints that showed no trace of the disease that had defined her life for over a decade. Medical science had no explanation, but Margaret knew exactly what had happened. Her consciousness had shifted from identification with disease to recognition of divine wholeness. Then there's David's journey, which reveals how this principle works with material circumstances just as powerfully as physical healing. David was an architect with genuine talent, but talent wasn't paying the bills. He couldn't find steady work. Bill collectors called his house daily, and his family faced the very real possibility of losing their home. The pressure was crushing, the fear constant. When someone told him about Wigglesworth's teaching, his first reaction was skepticism. How could 4 words change the fact that nobody was hiring him? How could spiritual consciousness pay his mortgage? But desperation has a way of opening minds, and David made a decision to try something completely different. Each morning before doing anything else, he would sit quietly and contemplate. I and the Father are one. At first, nothing seemed to change externally. The bills kept coming, the phone kept ringing with collection calls, but something was shifting internally. His mindset began transforming from one of desperate lack to one of confident connection. Instead of seeing himself as an unemployed architect scrambling for survival, he started recognizing his oneness with infinite intelligence and unlimited creativity. This wasn't fantasy or denial. It was a fundamental shift in how he understood his identity and his relationship to abundance. The impact manifested within 3 months. He felt guided to approach firms he'd previously overlooked, to make connections he'd thought were impossible. Suddenly, 2 different companies were competing for his services, and he accepted a position that paid 40% more than his previous income. The creative intelligence that had always been present finally found expression through his transformed consciousness. Write in the comments, "This is possible for me too," if you're recognizing that these aren't special cases but demonstrations of a spiritual law that applies to everyone, because what we're going to explore now shows you exactly how to begin applying this in your own life. But first, let me show you how this principle transformed the most intimate area of human experience: love and relationships. Sarah's story reveals something crucial about the hidden truth of consciousness that most marriage counselors never touch. If something shifted in your awareness while watching this, if you felt that spark of recognition or had an aha moment, go ahead and tap that like button. It helps this message reach others who are ready for this truth. After 23 years of marriage, Sarah was watching her relationship die in slow motion. Her husband had become distant, almost a stranger living in the same house. Every conversation turned into criticism. Every interaction felt heavy with resentment. The divorce papers were practically written in her mind. She'd already started making plans for what came after. But more painful than the failing marriage was how she saw herself. She'd become a wounded wife, someone who'd lost the ability to love or be loved, a woman whose best years were behind her and whose future looked empty and lonely. When a friend introduced her to Wigglesworth's teachings, Sarah initially thought it was irrelevant to her situation. What could spiritual consciousness do about the very practical reality of a husband who wouldn't even look at her anymore? But the journey she embarked on changed everything, not by fixing her husband or manipulating circumstances, but by transforming how she understood her own identity. She stopped identifying as the wounded, rejected, failed wife and began recognizing something deeper, her true nature as divine love expressing in human form. This wasn't about denying the pain or pretending everything was fine. It was about shifting her consciousness from the level where she was a victim of circumstances to the level where she was the expression of infinite love itself. And here's what happened that nobody expected. As her consciousness changed, her entire way of being in the relationship transformed. She became less reactive to her husband's criticisms, more compassionate in her responses, naturally expressing the love that was her essence, rather than the resentment that had become her habit. She wasn't trying to change him or save the marriage. She was simply being who she truly was. Her husband noticed. Something in him began responding to this shift in her presence. The defensiveness started melting. The distance began closing. Today, they'll tell you their marriage is stronger than it was even in the beginning. But the real revelation is that nothing changed until Sarah's consciousness changed. The love was always there. The potential for connection never left. But it could only manifest through transformed awareness. Now let me show you the practical technique that makes this accessible in your daily life. Because Wigglesworth understood that spiritual realization can't be limited to moments of crisis or formal meditation, he developed what he called practicing the presence. And this is where the transformation becomes a lifestyle rather than just an occasional experience. The pattern is simple but profoundly effective. You set aside time each morning, even just 15 minutes, to contemplate this truth of I and the Father are one, not as something you're trying to make happen or achieve, but as recognition of what already is and has always been true. Then throughout your day, whenever you feel that familiar stress creeping in, whenever fear starts gripping your mind, whenever you bump up against a limitation or problem, you pause and return to this awareness. Just for a moment, you remember who you really are. This isn't escapism or avoiding responsibility. It's actually the most practical approach possible because it addresses the consciousness that creates all your outer experiences. Every decision you make, every word you speak, every action you take flows from consciousness. So when you shift consciousness, everything shifts. Put down, "I'm practicing this today" in the comments if you're ready to integrate this awareness into your actual daily life, because what we're about to explore reveals the specific moments when this principle becomes most powerful and transformative. Wigglesworth taught something that completely flips conventional wisdom on its head, and understanding this distinction will determine whether you experience breakthrough or remain stuck in the same patterns. When a challenge appears in your life, and challenges will always appear, your natural human instinct is to see it as a problem that needs solving. You get a medical diagnosis and immediately think about treatment options. You face financial pressure and start strategizing about money. A relationship conflict arises and you begin analyzing what went wrong. This entire approach, though it seems logical and practical, keeps you locked in the consciousness that created the problem in the first place. Wigglesworth discovered something radically different. He taught people to recognize every challenge not as a problem to solve, but as an invitation to remember who they really are. Think about the profound shift this creates. When illness appears, your first response isn't to fight the disease or struggle against symptoms. Instead, you recognize the consciousness that knows no sickness, the spiritual wholeness that is your true nature. When lack manifests in your bank account or circumstances, you don't desperately scramble for supply or worry about scarcity. You realize your inseparable oneness with infinite abundance, the creative intelligence that is the source of all provision. This approach seems completely backward to human thinking, and that's exactly why most people never experience the transformation they're seeking. They're trying to change effects while remaining stuck in the consciousness that produces those effects. The hidden truth here is that consciousness is always cause, and the appearance world is always effect. You cannot permanently change effects by manipulating them directly. You can only transform effects by shifting the consciousness that creates them. This is spiritual law, as precise and reliable as any physical law, but operating at a level most people never access because they're too focused on the visible, tangible appearances. Now let me take you deeper into what Wigglesworth called living from the invisible. Most people navigate life based entirely on what they can see, hear, touch, and measure through their physical senses. They make decisions based on current bank balances, medical test results, what other people say about them, how circumstances appear in the moment. This is living from the visible, from the appearance world, and it keeps you perpetually reactive to conditions that are already manifested effects of past consciousness. But when you truly know I and the Father are one, you begin living from an entirely different foundation, the invisible realm of spiritual truth that underlies all physical appearances. This doesn't mean denying what appears to be happening or pretending problems don't exist. It means recognizing a deeper reality that transcends and supersedes appearances. When you live from the invisible, your decisions stop being emotional reactions to circumstances and become expressions of spiritual discernment. You're no longer pushed around by what seems to be true in the physical realm, because you're anchored in what is true in the spiritual realm. Your actions flow from divine intelligence rather than human struggling, and the impact of this shift cannot be overstated. The journey into this way of living requires practice and patience, but the revelations that come make every effort worthwhile. You start noticing that when you make decisions from this consciousness of oneness rather than from fear or desperation, better outcomes unfold naturally. Doors open that were previously closed. Solutions appear that you couldn't have engineered through human effort. Resources flow from unexpected sources because you're tapped into the infinite rather than limited by appearances. Write in the comments, "I choose the invisible truth," if you're beginning to understand how living from spiritual consciousness rather than physical appearances changes everything. Because what comes next reveals the obstacle that stops most people from experiencing the full transformation this principle offers, and it's something Wigglesworth himself had to learn the hard way. But before we get to that, let me reveal something about how this consciousness actually flows through you in daily life, because there's a hidden dimension here that changes the entire game. Wigglesworth, discovered what he called impersonal love, and this concept is so counterintuitive that most people miss its power completely. Here's what he realized: the love that flows through your consciousness, the wisdom that guides your decisions, the creative power that manifests as your experiences, none of it is actually personal to you. It's not yours in the sense of being something you possess or own. It's divine principle expressing as you and through you to bless all of creation. When you truly understand I and the Father are one, you realize you're not a separate individual trying to accumulate good things for yourself. You're a channel through which infinite good flows into the world. This shifts your entire motivation from self-serving to service. And here's the paradox that Wigglesworth proved over and over. This impersonal approach brings more harmony to your personal experience than any amount of self-focused effort ever could. When you stop trying to manipulate outcomes for personal benefit and instead become a clear expression of divine love and intelligence, life starts flowing with an ease that seems almost miraculous. The pressure lifts because you're no longer carrying the burden of making everything work through personal will and effort. You're cooperating with spiritual law instead of fighting against it. Now let me be honest with you about the biggest obstacle you're going to face on this journey, because understanding this will save you months or even years of unnecessary struggle. The human mind has tremendous resistance to letting go of separation consciousness. Your ego mind, that part of you that has been programmed since birth to believe in struggle and limitation, will rebel against this teaching. You'll sit down to practice recognizing I and the Father are one, and thoughts will flood in. This isn't realistic. This is just spiritual bypassing. Nothing is actually changing. I'm wasting my time. These thoughts feel so convincing, so real, that most people give up before the transformation can take root. Here's what most people don't know. Wigglesworth himself struggled with this principle for years before experiencing consistent results. Years. This man, who would eventually become synonymous with miraculous healings and impossible transformations, went through long periods where his mind fought against the very truth he was trying to embody. The difference between him and those who quit is that he understood something crucial about how consciousness transformation works. You don't fight the resistant thoughts. You don't judge yourself for having doubts. You simply acknowledge them without giving them power, and then you gently return to the awareness of oneness. Think of it like training a muscle. Every time you notice your mind has wandered into fear, limitation, or separation consciousness, and you bring it back to the truth of I and the Father are one, you're strengthening your spiritual awareness. The resistance isn't a sign that you're doing it wrong. It's actually part of the process. Your old consciousness is defending itself because transformation threatens its existence. But each time you return to truth despite the resistance, you're choosing a new identity, building a new foundation, creating new neural pathways that will eventually become your default way of experiencing reality. The impact of persistence here cannot be overstated. Most people quit right before the breakthrough, right before the shift becomes permanent, because they interpret the resistance as evidence that the principle isn't working. Put down, I'm not giving up in the comments if you recognize that resistance is part of the transformation, not proof that it's failing, because what we're about to explore shows you how to move through this resistance into the state where this becomes your natural way of being, rather than something you have to constantly work at. Because here's what happens when you persist through the resistance. The practice starts moving beyond formal meditation or designated spiritual time and begins integrating into every moment of your ordinary day. Advanced practitioners of Wigglesworth's teaching discovered something remarkable. They stopped compartmentalizing their lives into spiritual moments and regular moments. Instead, they learned to maintain the awareness of I and the Father are one while washing dishes, driving to work, having conversations, making dinner, paying bills. These mundane activities that most people rush through on autopilot became opportunities to practice presence, to feel the consciousness of divine intelligence flowing through even the simplest actions. This might sound like a small shift, but the impact is revolutionary. When you maintain this awareness during routine activities, you're gradually dissolving that artificial separation between spiritual time and ordinary time. You stop being someone who meditates for 15 minutes in the morning and then spends the rest of the day in separation consciousness. Instead, you become someone who lives from the awareness of oneness, who operates from that consciousness as your foundation, rather than just thinking about it occasionally. A businessman who applied this principle found that maintaining the awareness during meetings, phone calls, and strategic decisions transformed his entire professional life. Colleagues started commenting on his unusual clarity and calm authority. His business results improved not because he was working harder, but because divine intelligence was flowing through his work, rather than human striving and manipulation. This is the journey from spiritual theory to lived reality, and it happens through consistent practice in the midst of your actual daily life. Now let me show you what Wigglesworth called the illumined life, because this is where everything we've been talking about leads. After sustained practice, after persisting through resistance, after integrating this awareness into your daily activities, something shifts at such a deep level that your entire experience of being human transforms. You stop having to consciously effort to remember spiritual principles because they become your natural way of experiencing reality. Health, abundance, loving relationships, meaningful work, inner peace. These stop being goals you're chasing or states you're trying to achieve. They become your normal experience because your consciousness has permanently aligned with divine harmony. You're no longer living from reactive human nature, constantly responding to circumstances with fear or anxiety. You're living from your spiritual center, handling challenges from wisdom rather than panic, responding to people with love rather than resentment, moving through life with confidence rather than constant worry. This doesn't mean problems stop appearing or life becomes effortless in the sense that you never face difficulties. It means your relationship to challenges completely transforms. When something difficult arises, you don't spiral into separation consciousness. You naturally return to the awareness of oneness, and from that consciousness, you respond with a wisdom and grace that surprises even yourself. Solutions appear that you couldn't have manufactured through human effort. Doors open that seemed permanently closed. Resources flow from directions you never anticipated. The revelations keep deepening because once you're established in this consciousness, you realize you're not just changing your individual life. You're becoming a presence that affects everyone around you. People feel something different when they're near you, though they might not be able to articulate what it is. Write in the comments, "I'm living this now," if you're committed to making this illumined consciousness your permanent reality. Because what remains to be understood is how this transformation affects not just you, but ripples out into the world in ways you might never fully realize. When you embody this consciousness, you become a walking demonstration of what's possible when human awareness aligns with divine truth. So if you've stayed with me through this entire exploration, you're clearly someone who's ready for something deeper than surface-level spirituality. You're not looking for quick fixes or temporary feel-good moments. You're seeking genuine transformation. That's exactly why I create this content, and if these teachings resonate with you, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to this channel. There's so much more to explore together about how consciousness creates reality and how ancient spiritual wisdom applies to your modern life. Leave a comment saying, "This message found me," if you feel like this video arrived at exactly the right moment in your journey. I read every single comment, and I'm genuinely curious to know where you are in this process of awakening to your true nature, and if this content created value for you. If something shifted in your understanding or awareness while watching, just tap that like button. It helps this message reach others who are searching for the same truth you've been seeking. There's a video right here that goes even deeper into how to practically apply spiritual consciousness in specific areas of your life. Click and continue with me over there because the journey doesn't end here. It's really just beginning.